Dust and blood choked the air as six-cornered SEALs braced for their final stand against 50 advancing insurgents. "Broken Arrow, we are black on ammo," their radio man whispered into the static. No rescue choppers were coming. Instead, a single supersonic crack from an empty ridge violently shifted the odds. The mission brief had classified the objective as a routine key leader engagement in the Zabul province. For Chief Petty Officer Thomas Beckett and his six-man element from SEAL Team 4, routine was a word that usually preceded disaster. It was August 2018, and the Afghan summer heat was oppressive, baking the arid earth into a cracked, unyielding surface that radiated heat like an open oven. They had inserted under the cover of a moonless night, trekking 6 miles through rugged, vertical terrain to reach a target compound perched on the edge of a deep ravine. The intelligence suggested a mid-level bomb maker was utilizing the mud brick ruins as a staging ground. But intelligence, as Beckett often reminded his men, was just highly educated guesswork. By 0600 hours, the sun had crested the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, casting long, deceptive shadows across the valley floor. That was when the valley erupted. It didn't start with a single shot, but a deafening, coordinated crescendo of violence. Heavy machine gun fire tore through the silence, tearing chunks of clay and dust from the walls of the compound where Beckett's team had established their overwatch. "Contact front!" shouted Petty Officer First Class Wyatt Hayes, diving behind a crumbling parapet, just as a volley of PKM rounds chewed through the space where his chest had been a fraction of a second prior. The ambush was textbook, an L-shaped kill zone that caught the SEALs with their backs to the sheer drop of the ravine. To their left, an elevated ridge swarmed with insurgents. Conservative estimates put them at 50, heavily armed with AK-47s, RPK light machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. To their right, a secondary force was maneuvering through the dried-out wadi to cut off any avenue of escape. "Return fire! Shift left! Suppress that ridgeline!" Beckett roared over the din, shouldering his Mark 18 assault rifle and firing controlled bursts into the tree line. Next to him, Petty Officer Second Class Nathan "Doc" Miller was already dragging Corporal Dave Danvers to hard cover. Danvers had taken a round through the shoulder in the opening seconds, and his uniform was rapidly soaking with dark arterial blood. "I need pressure on this," Miller yelled, his hand slick as he applied a tourniquet high and tight on Danvers's arm. "He's losing volume fast, Chief." "Hayes, get on the horn. We need air support yesterday," Beckett commanded, dropping an empty magazine and slapping a fresh one into the magwell. Hayes was huddled over his PRC 117 multiband radio. The antenna bent at an awkward angle. "TOC, this is Romeo 20. We are taking effective heavy fire from multiple elevated positions. We have one urgent surgical, requesting immediate close air support, and QRF. How copy?" Static hissed back, followed by a fragmented, digitized voice. "Romeo 20, TOC. Be advised. Weather cell moving in. All rotary assets grounded. Fixed wing is 20 mics out. Hold your perimeter." 20 minutes. In a firefight of this intensity, 20 minutes was a lifetime. An RPG shrieked through the air, detonating against the outer wall of their compound. The concussive wave threw Beckett to the ground, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Dust choked the air, turning the morning light into a hazy, suffocating brown fog. Through the ringing in his ears, Beckett assessed his men. Danvers was pale, slipping in and out of consciousness. Hayes was firing his weapon with one hand while desperately trying to re-establish a clear line to the operations center. Miller was out of suppression grenades. They had been pinned down for less than 10 minutes, and their ammunition reserves were already critically low. The insurgents knew it too. The heavy fire began to slacken, replaced by the terrifying sound of tactical commands being shouted in Pashto. They were bounding forward, moving from rock to rock, closing the noose. Beckett looked at Hayes, his face grim, caked in sweat and cordite. "Tell them," Beckett said softly, the resignation heavy in his throat. Hayes swallowed hard, keyed the handset, and shielded the microphone from the roar of gunfire. He didn't shout, he didn't scream, he just whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 6 men who knew they were making their final stand. TOC, Romeo 20, Broken Arrow, we are black on ammo, send help. Silence hung over the radio. The enemy was less than 100 yards away. Beckett drew his Sig Sauer P226 sidearm, checking the chamber. If they were going down, they were going to make the enemy pay in blood for every inch of dirt. He closed his eyes for a microsecond, bracing for the final assault. Then, the valley echoed with a sound that did not belong to the erratic, chattering bursts of AK-47s. It was a singular, deep, chest-thumping crack, followed by the supersonic snap of a heavy projectile breaking the sound barrier directly over their heads. 1,000 yards away, perched on an opposing, razor-backed ridge designated on topographical maps only as Elevation 814, Chief Petty Officer Riley Harper exhaled slowly. For the past 72 hours, Riley had been a ghost. As a Tier 1 precision marksman, and one of the very few women to have quietly and rigorously integrated into the shadowy echelons of naval special warfare, she was operating on a strictly compartmentalized reconnaissance mission. Her objective had been to monitor a suspected weapons cache 3 miles north of Beckett's position. But war is fluid, and intelligence is flawed. When she intercepted the frantic, breaking radio transmissions from Romeo 20, she made a calculated, career-risking decision. She abandoned her hide site, humped her 80-pound pack across 2 miles of treacherous, near-vertical shale in the dark, and set up a new final firing position overlooking the nameless valley. She arrived just as the sun rose, just as the ambush was sprung. Riley lay completely motionless under a heavily modified ghillie suit, blending seamlessly into the scrub brush and jagged limestone. In front of her was the Macmillan Taser .338 sniper rifle, a weapon chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, capable of neutralizing targets at well over a mile. She wasn't supposed to be here. Officially, she didn't exist in this grid square. But as she watched the insurgents bounding toward the trapped SEALs through the magnification of her Night Force Attica scope, protocol ceased to matter. Broken Arrow, we are black on ammo. Send help. Hayes's whispered plea had cracked through her earpiece. Help is here, boys, Riley murmured to herself, her voice barely a breath. She didn't have a spotter. She was calculating her own windage, reading the mirage rising off the baked earth, computing the spin drift, the Coriolis effect, and the barometric pressure in her head. The distance to the lead insurgent was 1,120 yards. She dialed her elevation turret. The wind was a full value crosswind from 3 o'clock, blowing at approximately 8 miles per hour. She held 1.5 mils left of her target. Her crosshairs settled on the chest of an insurgent, raising an RPG to his shoulder, preparing to deliver the killing blow to the SEAL's compound. Riley controlled her breathing. Inhale. Exhale. Pause. At the bottom of her respiratory pause, between heartbeats, her finger applied 3 pounds of steady pressure to the trigger. Crack! The heavy rifle kicked back into her shoulder, a controlled violence. It took nearly 1.5 seconds for the 250-grain bullet to cross the valley. Through the scope, Riley watched the kinetic energy of the round impact. The insurgent with the RPG was violently thrown backward off his feet, the unfired rocket spiraling harmlessly into the dirt. Down in the compound, Beckett flinched at the supersonic snap. He looked up, bewildered. Who the hell fired that? Before anyone could answer, a second crack rolled across the valley like delayed thunder. On the ridge, an insurgent manning a PKM machine gun suddenly slumped over his weapon, his helmet shattered. "Sniper! We have a sniper!" An insurgent commander screamed in Pashto, pointing wildly toward Ridge 814. But pointing was a fatal mistake. Riley cycled the bolt of the TAC-338 with terrifying speed and precision. A smoking brass casing ejected, glittering briefly in the sun before landing softly on a piece of canvas she had laid down. She chambered a new round. Target 3, Commander, 1,080 yards. Adjust hold, squeeze, crack. The commander dropped mid-sentence. Panic rippled through the enemy line. The coordinated assault completely stalled. The insurgents, who seconds ago had been confident hunters closing in on cornered prey, were suddenly thrown into absolute chaos. They couldn't see the shooter. At over 1,000 yards, the sound of the gunshot reached them long after the bullet had already done its lethal work, making it impossible to pinpoint her exact location. "Doc, you seeing this?" Beckett asked, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief as he peered over the parapet. "They're dropping, Chief. Somebody is tearing them apart," Miller replied, tightening the bandage on Danvers. "Is it the QRF?" "No," Beckett muttered, listening to the rhythmic, methodical cadence of the distant shots. QRF rolls heavy. That's a single shooter. Someone's up there on the high ground. Up on elevation 814, Riley was in the bubble. The world narrowed down to the circle of her optic. Adrenaline was entirely suppressed by years of grueling, mind-breaking training. She was a machine of mathematics and ballistics. Target 4. Moving target. Lateral sprint. 1,150 yards. She trapped the target, leading him by 2 full mils. Squeezed. The running man folded in on himself, tumbling into the dust. Target 5. In defilade, trying to flank right. She adjusted her bipod an inch to the right. Squeeze. Another cloud of pink mist against the tan rock. She dropped 5 men in less than 60 seconds. The insurgents realized their frontal assault was suicide and desperately tried to retreat into the rocky outcroppings for cover. But Riley had spent the last hour mapping the terrain in her mind. What the enemy thought was cover was actually enfilade. She had a clear line of sight right down their hiding spots. She reloaded her 5-round magazine smoothly, never taking her eye off the scope. "TOC. Romeo 20. Hayes spoke into the radio, his voice rising with a sudden, frantic hope. "Be advised, we have unknown friendly forces engaging the enemy from the eastern ridge. Enemy assault has halted. They are taking heavy casualties. Romeo 20. TOC. We have no friendly assets in your grid. Repeat, no friendly assets. Confirm visual. Negative visual? TOC. But whoever is up there is hitting shots from a different zip code. It's a goddamn ghost." Riley heard the transmission. A faint, grim smile touched the corner of her mouth. She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, adjusted her cheek weld, and found her next target. The enemy was regrouping, trying to set up a mortar tube behind a rusted-out Soviet tank hull to flush her out. "Not today," she whispered. She calculated the drop for 1,200 yards. It was a steep angle, requiring precise minute of angle adjustments. She held her breath, the crosshairs resting exactly where the mortar loader would step out. He stepped out. Crack. That was number 6. 19 to go. By the time the sun had fully crested, turning the valley into a blinding, shadowless cauldron of heat, the psychological tide of the battle had violently shifted. The insurgents, initially an overwhelming force of 50 battle-hardened fighters, were now pinned down by their own fear. 14 of their men lay dead in the dust, dismantled by a ghost who spoke only in the thunderous, methodical crack of a .338 Lapua Magnum. Down in the mud-brick compound, Chief Petty Officer Thomas Beckett and his men used the miraculous reprieve to fortify their collapsing perimeter. "Evans, consolidate the remaining SAW ammo," Beckett barked, sliding across the dirt to where Private First Class Timothy Evans, an Army infantryman attached to their element for regional navigation, was frantically tearing open a green canvas bandolier. "I've got maybe 200 rounds, Chief." "That's it," Evans replied, his voice cracking through a dry, dust-coated throat. "Make it count," Beckett ordered. He crawled over to Doc Miller, who was kneeling over Corporal Danvers. The wounded SEAL was ghost-pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. "How long does he have, Doc?" "The tourniquet is holding, but he needs whole blood and he needs a surgeon," Miller said grimly, checking Danvers' fading radial pulse. If that bird isn't here in 20 minutes, we're going to lose him, Chief. Beckett keyed his radio. Hayes, talk to me. Where is our air? Fixed wing is 10 mics out, Hayes replied, his eyes scanning the eastern ridge through his binoculars. Chief, you need to see this. The enemy is breaking contact with us. Beckett risked a glance over the crumbling parapet. Hayes was right. The heavy suppressive fire that had trapped them against the ravine had ceased. Instead of pushing the compound, the remaining insurgents, roughly 30 fighters, were peeling off in disciplined, bounding movements, retreating into the deep wadi. But they weren't fleeing. They were changing their axis of advance. They were pivoting toward elevation 814. They've figured out where the shooter is, Evans muttered, watching the enemy fighters disappear into the dead space at the base of the mountain. They're sending a hunting party up the ridge. They're going to swarm him. Whoever is up there just bought us our lives, Beckett said, his jaw tightening. He looked at his depleted team, then at the steep, jagged incline of the mountain. We can't leave them hanging. Suppressive fire on the base of that ridge. Do not let them climb unmolested. 1,000 yards away, and 500 feet higher in elevation, Chief Petty Officer Riley Harper was already adapting to the shifting geometry of the battlefield. Through the mirage rising off her suppressed barrel, she watched the enemy commander wave a furious hand toward her position. A splinter group of 20 men detached from the main element and began a rapid, aggressive ascent up the shale-covered slope. She had become the primary target. Riley's breathing remained steady, a practiced rhythm of inhale, exhale, and assessment. The first rule of a sniper hide is that it is temporary. Once you establish a pattern, you die. She had taken 14 shots from this specific rock outcropping. It was time to displace. She smoothly extracted the 5-round magazine from her Macmillan TAS 338, cleared the chamber, and caught the ejected brass casing. Leaving zero trace was a fundamental principle. Slinging the heavy, 14-pound rifle across her back, she grabbed her drag bag and low-crawled backward through the razor-sharp scrub brush, letting the ghillie suit do its work. She moved 300 yards south along the spine of the ridge, her boots finding silent purchase on the loose rock. The heat inside her suit was suffocating, her core temperature pushing dangerously high, but she pushed the physical discomfort into a locked box in her mind. She reached her secondary hide, a narrow fissure between two massive granite boulders that offered a dominating view of the ascent route. She dropped her pack and immediately pulled an M18A1 Claymore mine from an external pouch. Moving swiftly, she planted the curved, olive-drab explosive into the dirt, angling it downward toward the only viable foot trail leading to her position. She unspooled the detonation wire, trailing it back to her fissure. Click. The detonator was armed. She set up her TAC 338 on its bipod, adjusting the parallax on her Night Force scope. The enemy was climbing fast, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need for revenge. They were no longer at 1,000 yards. The leading edge of the hunting party was closing the gap to 600 yards, navigating a steep, 45-degree incline. Riley pulled her ballistic dope card from her wrist sleeve. A steep, downward angle required a specific mathematical adjustment. Gravity would act on the bullet for a shorter horizontal distance, meaning she had to aim lower than the actual line-of-sight distance suggested. She calculated the angle cosine in her head, dialing back her elevation turret. Target 15. A fighter in a black tunic, hauling a heavy PKM up a goat trail. She settled her crosshairs on his chest. The wind had died down to a whisper. Crack! The supersonic round struck the fighter center mass. The sheer kinetic energy lifted him off his feet, sending him tumbling backward down the steep scree slope, taking two other insurgents with him in an avalanche of loose rock and dust. The enemy hunting party immediately hit the dirt, wildly spraying AK-47 fire up the mountain. Bullets snapped and cracked against the granite boulders, hiding Riley, showering her back with razor-sharp rock fragments. She didn't flinch. She cycled the bolt. Target 16. A man shouting into a handheld radio behind a dead cedar stump. Crack. The radio shattered, along with the man holding it. Down below, Beckett and his team were watching the spectacle with a mixture of awe and horror. "He's dropping them on the move," Evans whispered, firing a short, controlled burst from his M4 to keep the lower insurgents pinned. "Who the hell is this guy? Is he Delta? CIA ground branch?" "I don't care if it's the ghost of Chris Kyle," Beckett growled. "Keep the pressure on the base. Don't let them reinforce." Up on the ridge, the situation was deteriorating. Riley was chewing through her ammunition. She had brought 40 rounds of .338 Lapua. She was down to her last 10. The insurgents were adapting. Realizing that the sniper was picking them off one by one, they abandoned the trail and spread out, utilizing the deep, natural trenches cut into the mountainside by centuries of flash floods. They were moving in defilade, invisible to Riley's scope, until they crested the final 100 yards. She checked her watch. 10 minutes had passed since the SEALs called for air support. Fast movers should be in the airspace any second. But a second in combat is an eternity. A sharp clatter of rocks alerted her. To her left, flanking her Fisher. Riley abandoned the sniper rifle. She drew her sidearm, a customized Glock 19, and transitioned to a crouching kneel. An insurgent vaulted over a low rock wall, his AK-47 raising to fire. Riley shot him twice in the chest and once in the T-box, the bridge of the nose. He crumpled instantly. Target 17. Before his body hit the ground, 2 more poured over the ridgeline. Riley dropped the first with 2 rapid shots to the torso, target 18, but the second lunged, swinging the wooden stock of his rifle like a club. It connected with Riley's shoulder, sending a spike of blinding pain down her arm and knocking the Glock from her grip. She rolled with the impact, the heavy ghillie suit cushioning the blow against the rocks. The insurgent racked the bolt of his weapon, standing over her. Riley didn't hesitate. She drew a fixed-blade combat knife from her chest rig and drove it upward into the femoral artery of the fighter's thigh. He shrieked, his finger convulsing on the trigger and sending a wild burst of fire into the sky before he collapsed. Target 19. She scrambled back to her rifle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her left shoulder screamed in agony, but the adrenaline overrode the pain. She grabbed the Claymore detonator. 3 more insurgents were charging up the main trail, screaming battle cries, convinced they finally had the sniper cornered. They hit the kill box. Riley squeezed the clacker. A deafening boom shook the mountain. 700 steel ball bearings, propelled by a pound of C4 explosive, ripped through the brush in a lethal 60-degree arc. The 3 charging fighters were instantly neutralized. Targets 20, 21, 22. Silence, heavy and ringing, descended on the ridge. The silence was abruptly shattered by a sound that every American infantryman knows and loves. The deep, guttural roar of twin turbofan engines tearing through the atmosphere. "TOC, Romeo 20, I have visual on the fast movers," Hayes screamed into the radio, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. 2 A-10 Thunderbolt 2 attack aircraft dropped out of the clouds, diving like prehistoric birds of prey toward the valley. "Romeo 20, this is Warthog Actual." A calm, crackling voice filled the SEAL's earpieces. "We have you visual. Paint the target." Beckett grabbed a laser designator and painted the wadi, where the remaining main body of insurgents was attempting to regroup. "Cleared hot! Cleared hot! Bring the rain!" The lead A-10 pitched downward. A stream of smoke erupted from the nose of the aircraft, followed 2 seconds later by the terrifying, world-ending brrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr earth in the wadi simply erupted, vaporizing the remaining enemy forces in a spectacular line of fire, dust, and shrapnel. Up on Ridge 814, Riley collapsed against the granite wall. Her chest heaved. Her ghillie suit was torn, soaked in sweat and the blood of the men she had fought, hand to hand. She watched the A-10s bank hard and begin a secondary gun run. The valley was completely secure. She reached for her encrypted radio, switching to the SEAL's tactical frequency. Her voice was raspy, exhausted, but completely steady. Romeo 20, this is Ghost Actual. You are clear. The ridge is secure. Threat neutralized. Down in the compound, Beckett froze. He looked at Hayes, then at Evans. The voice that had just spoken over the comms wasn't the deep, gravelly baritone of a recon marine or a Delta operator. It was undeniably, distinctly female. "Ghost Actual, this is Romeo 20, Beckett replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Copy that. We owe you our lives. Extraction bird is inbound. We have room for one more. Get your ass down here. Copy 20. Moving to your LZ." 10 minutes later, the heavy thwack 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 of a MH-47 Chinook helicopter filled the valley. The massive twin-rotor bird flared over the compound, touching down in a blinding sandstorm of its own creation. The ramp dropped. Beckett and Miller carried Danvers aboard on a makeshift litter, sprinting through the rotor wash. Hayes and Evans followed, covering the rear. As they strapped into the canvas seats of the deafeningly loud cargo bay, Beckett refused to sit. He stood by the ramp, staring out into the dust-choked valley. Through the brownout, a solitary figure emerged. She was covered head to toe in a ragged, dusty ghillie suit. A massive sniper rifle was slung across her back, and an olive-drab drag bag trailed from her hand. She moved with a slow, deliberate limp, her left arm hanging stiffly at her side. As she walked up the ramp, the crew chief signaled the pilots, and the Chinook immediately lifted off, banking hard toward the safety of the base at Kandahar. Inside the dimly lit belly of the aircraft, the tension was palpable. The SEALs stared at the figure who had single-handedly broken a 50-man ambush and dropped 22 enemy fighters. Riley unbuckled the chin strap of her helmet. With a wince of pain, she pulled the helmet and her protective ballistic goggles off, shaking out her dark, sweat-matted hair. She wiped a smear of dirt and dried blood from her cheek and looked up, meeting Beckett's gaze. For a long moment, nobody spoke over the roar of the engines. The hardened operators of SEAL Team 4 simply stared in silent, absolute reverence at the woman standing before them. Beckett stepped forward. He didn't offer a salute. Tier 1 operators rarely did in the field. Instead, he extended a dirt-caked hand. "Chief Petty Officer Thomas Beckett," he said, his voice carrying over the engine noise. Riley took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite the exhaustion. "Chief Petty Officer Riley Harper, Naval Special Warfare Development Group." Evans, the young Army private, let out a low whistle. "Chief Harper, I don't know what they teach you at DevGru, but you just dropped 22 guys by yourself." Riley offered a small, weary but entirely professional smile. She leaned back against the canvas netting, her eyes reflecting the quiet, cold reality of the world she operated in. 25, Riley corrected softly, closing her eyes as the adrenaline finally began to ebb. "I shot the mortarman, the RPG gunner, and the commander first." The Chinook climbed higher, leaving the burning valley of Zabul far behind. Down below, the enemy would whisper legends of the Phantom on Ridge 814. But up in the sky, surrounded by the men whose lives she had pulled from the fire, Riley Harper simply adjusted her sling and finally allowed herself to rest. The legend of Ridge 814 remains largely classified, hidden behind redacted operational reports and the quiet, unwritten code of Tier 1 operators. It stands as a testament to the fact that heroism possesses no gender, only an unyielding capacity for precision under unimaginable pressure. In the shadows where true warfare is fought, survival hinges not on the strength of a radio call, but on the silent guardians who answer it.